What we got here is failure to communicate, a chronic neglect of military mental health care. This is Psychiatric Casualties, how and why the military ignores the full cost of war.
Welcome again to Psychiatric Casualties. I'm Mark Russell.
Charles Figley here.
And Charles and I are going to talk about the second segment to the 8th chapter of this book we wrote together, Psychiatric Casualties. And this has to do with the military's tactic to delay, deceive, and delay again in regards to its public relations, its publicity campaign in avoiding recognition of the psychological realities of warfare.
Yeah, let me just mention, if any of you have some interesting stories related to what we're talking about, examples of what we're talking about, that would be terrific if you could write us, audio tape, videotape, whatever, one way or the other, to let us know what your situation is or was. That would be helpful. What do you think, Mark?
Yeah, no, I totally agree. We're talking to each other about these things, but I don't get a lot of feedback since I'm no longer in the military or in academia. So I don't get a lot of feedback outside of what we've talked about. So it would be great to hear from other listeners what their experiences are.
But when you were in the academy, when you were in university, you definitely got feedback then.
Oh, yeah,
So,
sure. A bit of feedback.
Me too. I mean, it's like,
yeah, most of the times when I've lectured about this, when I was teaching at a graduate school for about 13 years or so. And a lot of times the responses were, of course, many of these people had not served in the military. Some had, some of the students, maybe one or two of the faculty, but generally speaking, people were not of that 1% that serve in the military. And they were just flabbergasted, like, how in the hell can this be? You got to be kidding me. It can't be this bad. Surely, Russell, you're exaggerating things and trying to make a point. If anything, I feel like it's almost minimizing their full effect and the issues that are at hand and the enormity of the problem as far as military mental health care. But yeah, so people didn't quite know what to think of it. It just seems kind of overwhelmingly, obvious and pathetic that the military hasn't. It's not just the military, it's Congress too, because Congress and the executive branch have a role to, as far as setting policies and monitoring what the military does.
well, just stick with the college students.
Yeah.
And they're so shocked and amazed and all that sort of thing.
Sure.
But they don't think about it any more than that.
No.
They go on with their life.
That's right.
And if you're a wife of a service member who has been injured in any way,
sure,
that's part of your life. And it's so easy for all of us to sort of turn our heads and, move in a direction that is fun and interesting and rewarding. It's nice if you can do that. But our brothers and sisters in service can't do that easily. Many can, thank goodness.
Sure.
But many can't.
Yeah, many can't. And, it's the men and women who serve, it's their spouses, it's the children of those military families. So it's really got a ripple effect and even a transgenerational effect. These things have long lasting, ripples. And for that 1% that do raise their hand, I think, we talk as a country, politicians will talk about having to do what's right on behalf of the veterans and respecting the service and thanking veterans for their service, which is appropriate. But if you really want to thank veterans for their service and really want to support veterans and their families, you really, whatever your status is in the media and as a representative of the people or just a concerned citizen, really need to be pulling our head out of the sand. And when it comes to what is the realities, the psychological realities of war, and forcing the military to basically implement these lessons learned since that have been available since the First World War in terms of what we could do better in terms of
I
meeting
think
needs.
I think the people that are listening, that are paying attention,
Yeah,
do care, and they probably are part of the 1%, or they're related to someone who is 1%.
I would
I mean,
imagine so.
yeah, Kathy, I mean, her father and my father was in the military. Her brother went in the military. Her first husband was in the military.
Right.
So you have that kind of mentality, you have that perspective, that orientation to the way life is, and then it includes bad things like that. But to not get the respect that's deserved is really, well, it's disheartening, obviously, for the 1% and the people who care about the 1%. And it, for me at least, I've began to reconsider. I mean, I think that I'm going to reach where you are soon, but you have a positive attitude towards all this, so it's not too bad. But when you have, I mean, you'll see, Mark. I mean, I write up a lot of stuff in our book,
Yeah, see a
and
lot
of
of
course
notes.
the notes that I have that are ready to go.
Right.
But it's a life work, and I recognize that, and I'm wondering who will take our place, who will carry on, who will care enough about these men and women. I mean, in some ways, we're moving toward an era of mechanization and the amazing ways we can kill people. It always astounds me.
Oh yeah.
Uh, and that we're not going to maybe have that kind of opportunity in the future that we've had of being able to do the research and then feeling free to be able to share that with everybody. Uh, we have no qualms whatsoever, and if we get any kind of resistance, we make note of that.
Mhm.
And but at the same time, there isn't any resistance, and so I'm just concerned that if what you're talking about is true, and that there is this very predictable cycle, and
Yes.
that but you're still optimistic, you're still hopeful.
I guess I am. I don't understand quite why, maybe. I mean, when I talk about it, I don't sound I sound angry and bitter, which I am, and frustrated that things haven't changed. But when in researching this book, and I talk about lessons learned from every war generation, there was Colonel Thomas Salmon in the First World War. You get Roy Geiger and Albert Glass from the Second World War and from the Korean Wars. Glass also was served during the Vietnam War. These are all psychiatrists at the highest ranking who wrote these lessons learned and documented it for their respective war cohorts about what is needed to meet mental health needs in the military, where we failed and what succeeded and what needs to happen in the future. Unfortunately, after the Second World War, the military stopped writing its official lessons learned for neuropsychiatry. And at the Second World War, we talked about compiled 2 massive volumes, 36 plus 100 pages worth of data driven across every aspect of mental health care and in the military and what's needed to improve it. And that was the final compilation of lessons learned by the military. So go figure. I think that's part of this delay, deceive, and delay again tactic, is that not wanting to be transparent about that anymore. So as far as these recent wars, 20 years of wars of Iraq and Afghanistan, you will not find an official psychiatric lessons learned. Just not available.
Terrible.
The military doesn't do it. But yeah.
Do you have any idea why? I mean, is there any kind of evidence, anything one could point to as a factor in deciding not to do that anymore?
Oh no, without a doubt. I think if the current military took the posture of the Second World War, which is to document all of our failures and really transparent about the scope of the mental health crisis in the military and our failures and what is needed to fix those failures, right? And really provide adequate mental health care to veterans and their families. If they did it today, that document would be online. It'll be read by a lot more people than back in the Second World War. It would hold the military's feet to the fire. That they would have to do it, man. They would have to implement those lessons learned, because the lessons learned are so widely dispersed. You see, I think I have those 2 volumes of the Second World War. You probably don't have those volumes.
Yeah.
Most people, 99.9%, have never seen those volumes, and they're not available, widely available. So it's like I got it from Rare Book. So that's okay. Then the military can write these documents about lessons learned, but understanding that very few people would ever read it, and that the military wouldn't be held accountable. I think the Second World War generation believed that by writing those volumes, that these lessons will never be forgotten, and the future generations would not ignore it and they would implement it. That was their belief in their hearts. But the reality was many people didn't read those lessons learned, and they've been forgotten, ignored throughout, the rest of history up to this current day. So yeah, if the military was transparent and they took the second generation's lead and says, we're going to fix mental health care, and we're going to do right, and we're going to treat mental health on par with physical health, and we're going to end the cycle of crisis, it would have to do it. Because the information would be too widely available. You couldn't put your head in the sand again. So that's why they ignore it. So let me
it's each generation forgets certain things, and
Yes.
I mean, there's a lot of things that's forgotten among and between generations. But you'd think there are secretive, I'm not sure if it's secret or not, but there are legions, if you will, various organizations, legions that are devoted to understanding and respecting and appreciating and pushing the word out about their particular Marine Corps, for example. You and I were both in it.
Yeah.
It seems like if there was a group that was intent on focusing on the needs for mental health and where it's absent, et cetera, essentially this as the Bible, if you will, then yeah, that would be great. But I don't think it's going to happen unless it's part of that 1%. I mean, there has to be this commitment, this heart, feeling it in your gut that this is incredibly important.
Well, our book, Psychiatric Casualties, this is what we're basing this podcast on. What would happen if that book was made mandatory reading in the Naval and Army academies, and the Air Force Academy, right? And so when we're teaching young officers that are going to become the general officers and the admirals of the future, and they actually had to learn the psychiatric lessons that we document from each generation, right? That might have a means to penetrate this malaise and even cause all of us to be somewhat hopeful, right? So maybe that's the next step, is that, Charles, you can use your influence and your knowledge of the people and try to see if they can get this book as part of a required curriculum in teaching the future generations of military officers about
all those people, as far as I know, are not in the military. They've never been in the military and really don't get it and understand. I mean, you were talking about when you were teaching, it's the same way with me at Tulane University. And, I love the university, private university, et cetera, all kinds of cool things that's been done there, including myself. But the real challenge is there's no other veterans. I mean, as far as I know, there's no veterans on the faculty except when the tenured faculty, let's put it that way, which is the most, selective and the most highly revered. You want to hold on to them. That's why you give them tenure, et cetera. But, and all of my friends at Tulane, and certainly FSU as well, they were very empathic, they were sympathetic and concerned about the things that I'm concerned about, but only to a certain extent, because they haven't lived that experience. And I don't blame anybody. I've never blamed anyone, because, you just don't know because you were not there.
Yeah.
I've never had a conversation. I've that I've used those words.
Yeah.
And they've been very respectful, but it's kind of like out of mind, out of, what is it? Out of,
Well, they have no, whatever, skin in the game, right?
yeah.
If you have only 1% that serve in the military, then 99% have not. What is, they don't have really any skin in the game, any motivation to learn or to, make changes or to advocate for change, as far as military mental health care.
Hmm.
But even of that 1% who have served, enlisted and officer alike and family members and whatnot, there's really no one who has compiled the information that we have available. So, matter even if you were a military psychologist or psychiatrist or social worker, most likely you did not know the things that we're talking about because it's not published anywhere. It's not required reading for sure.
Well, and it certainly is not embraced by the military in terms of, the facts that we've uncovered.
No, it's really highly damning for the military, and for the military, they're view this as quite threatening, this type of transparency, because it might undermine their ability to fight and win future wars, which is
How
they can't wait to go to AI and robots to eliminate this whole pestering problem with psychiatric casualties, which is far outpacing the cost and prevalence of physical medical health cost of war.
Yeah, I agree that would be the solution.
Absolutely.
We wouldn't have all of these silly things we have to worry about in terms of feelings and emotions, etc.
Stigma and all that would go
Yeah.
away. Hey, if I might,
robots.
Yeah, that's right. And it's coming too. That's no joke. I mean, that's already you've seen that in Ukraine with the drones and all that's amped up to the nth degree as AI starts to become more prevalent. So maybe this will become a moot point at some time. Yeah.
What was that again?
I was saying that maybe this whole issue with military mental health care becomes a moot point because we would no longer have human beings having to deal with the psychological effects of warfare, at least the direct effects. Although those drone operators, we know that those folks can be subject to traumatic stressors. So that's.
Have you seen any research on that?
Oh yeah, I have. Sure.
Is that right?
Yeah.
That's great because I have
not.
Done. I have not seen that.
Yeah.
So they evaluate, they look at the lived experiences of these drone.
Yeah, the people who operate behind the drones that are, shooting the missiles or, killing the targets, but then, they're also seeing, collateral damage as it's called, right? And that's the stuff that really gets to a lot of us, is that the unintended victims, children, women, and elderly. But yeah, so there's studies available about remote operators developing conditions like PTSD or something to that effect.
Send me at least one of those so I would know where to look and where the cluster of information, because I think that is very what we're doing, right? We, as in those of us working on the special issue, are trying to position an understanding of compassion fatigue. But secondary trauma is really the essence of compassion fatigue. But secondary trauma is boring sounding, right? It's not as cool and interesting and blah, blah, blah.
Yeah.
So these drone operators are getting bombarded by secondary trauma all the time. And I believe they're not. I mean, if the military is consistently the way we're describing it, and there's put it out of your mind, they dismiss it, or that you're weak, all the things written about.
Absolutely.
So I'm pleasantly shocked that there have been studies. Now, it's not studies within the military, I'm sure, but outside of the military, right?
I'd have to go back and check that there might have been something done through the Army Research Center, possibly, but yeah, I'm pretty sure it's mostly outside researchers looking at
outside the military. Yeah, well, I'd like to see that, because that's
after we're done today.
That's an example of a new area of research with regard to mental health disturbances. That kind of work.
Well, I think it's a warning too to the military that even though there'll be fewer people affected, that would be operating those drones, but that the if they're envisioning the future warfare with robots and drones, that that there are going to be some human elements who will be witnessing what those drones and robots are doing as they are behind the controls or they're monitoring the automations, but that has some psychological effects on those people too. So that would be one of the lessons learned from the current wars is that just because you're sitting at a desk in New Mexico and what's happening is going, in the Middle East doesn't make you immune from,
Yeah, I mean,
for developing some issues after that.
It's related to the chapter and what we're studying in terms of the delays. How can we, before this blows up, how can we get this under wraps and not let anyone know?
Yeah. All
Or
right.
do you think there's a certain degree of embarrassment on the part of those that don't report this and that, like, oh, I meant maybe the only one that's having issues
Oh, of
associated
course.
with these drones?
Without a doubt. I know because I've seen several veterans, because I do VA disability exams, part-time. And I've seen several veterans come out of the military who were drone operators.
Ah,
And those are the report they felt like. They didn't want to really even file the claim because they didn't think that, they felt personally that it was a sign of personal weakness because they didn't see that other people necessarily had the problems that they were having and felt like it was something uniquely weak about them, that they're the ones who are having troubles with nightmares or perseverating intrusive thoughts, things of that sort.
well, we both do, legal work and testify for or against various things and people and all that.
Yeah.
There were a number of cases that were troubling. I mean, I want to focus on the chapter here, but
Yeah.
I think that whole area of secondary trauma is going to really explode sometime relatively soon because I'm now seeing secondary trauma and compassion fatigue among teachers, those that work in hospitals, both animal as well as human, and in terms of that and the difficulty, the frustration they have, particularly when they're like this chapter in which you have to maintain a certain stance or position or whatever, or it's going to be hidden in effect. But the thing that is most concerning, I guess, is how this bleeds out and affects other people, like the family, and how these kids, I'll just say, because I'm 80 years old, I can say that now, these kids are, on the one hand, suffering from this, but on the other hand, as you point out, are concerned about reporting it because they would be weeded out. But one of the main things, though, that's going to challenge that sort of stereotype is, I forget the name of the particular occupation, but they work for Facebook and all the other online programs, and they serve as a way of determining the acceptability of a message or of a photograph or whatever. You know what I'm saying? I forget what they're called. I mean, the name of the
They kind of monitor content monitors or something like that, right?
What is it called?
Content monitors?
Content, yes, content monitors, right. Yeah.
At least that's
and
what
there have been lots and lots of dropouts, but mostly there have been court cases in which the company has been forced to provide resources and to more effectively monitor how the staff is doing, etc.
Yeah, I was actually involved in one of those lawsuits.
Was that right?
Content monitors and some of the things that they were having to witness, as far as child rape and murders and beheadings and things like that are posted online, and they're having to see that and then remove it. But to remove it, they had to watch it and listen to it, and and there were very little protections provided by the companies that hired these individuals.
Well, you're not saying which company or whatever. So could you say what's the result of your effort?
I can't.
Okay. You can't say
I don't want-
anything?
I don't want to get sued by what the company, you come back and say, blah, 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 but it was a major internet provider, if you would, that hired a cadre of monitors to, do what we just talked about. And yeah, so they didn't provide services and some of the policies,
I hope.
a kind of a barrier, as they see in the military, for people to come forward if they had problems. So it was.
What happened? You can't talk about it?
It's
The
an ongoing,
monitors.
it's an ongoing legal case. I don't want to.
Oh, it's ongoing. Okay. Well, I'm sure it will be a long one because it's very important
Right.
consequences.
But it certainly goes to what you're talking about, the vicarious part, and then also the delay or deception part. So it's not unique to the military as far as delaying and deceiving about the psychological effects of what it is that is people are exposed to. But in talking about the military, I want to go back to this chapter if I can, because
Good.
one of the things I wanted to do before we conclude is to talk about a contemporary example, evidence, if you would, to support our claim that this delay, deceive, and delay again is an actual thing. It's not something that I made up or you made up, that it exists. So I'm gonna be quoting a lot, so and reading, so I apologize in advance. But if I can just I'll give a brief kind of chronology timeline. 2001, 2002 is the invasion of Afghanistan after 2001 terrorist attacks. 2003 is the invasion of Iraq. So I was deployed during the invasion of Iraq in support of the initial invasion in a field hospital. And then it became readily evident that we were not prepared to meet psychological needs. And we talked a little bit about that in previous episodes and talk more later on. But anyways, that's 2003. Around 2004, 5, 6, we started seeing the insurgencies in Iraq in particular, but was also occurring in Afghanistan as well, where we started having large numbers service members coming back with PTSD and depression, and suicide rates were spiking and persisting at very high levels. And a lot of media attention was being paid to both the suicide rates as well as untreated mental health needs of veterans who were being discharged from the military. So a lot of media stories, a lot of it. You go back from 2003, 2006, you'll see the media was flooded and Congress was reacting to it with a lot of armed service committee meetings and hearings about the issues of military mental health care, right? So that's the backdrop. On May 23, 2006, the DoD published its PR policy. It's what they call Public Affairs Guidance, or PAG, Public Affairs Guidance. And the purpose of that guidance was to coordinate accurate talking points and messages about mental health of soldiers returning from OIF and OEF, from Iraq and Afghanistan, for all military and VA spokespersons. So this is the PR policy for anyone who's going to speak to Congress or to the public, right? Quote, all Army spokespersons, and this includes all military spokespersons, whether they are PAOs, public affairs officers, commanders, chaplains, healthcare providers, etc., will speak accurately and with one voice on the issue of mental health and deployed and returning soldiers. Buy-in and continuity of message with other organizations, including the National Guard Bureau, U.S. Army Reserves, and Department of Veterans Affairs, are established and maintained. Establish and demonstrate to the American public that even though combat affects all soldiers, mentally and physically, the majority of soldiers returning from OIF and OEF are mentally healthy and transition home successfully.
50%.
I was saying the majority. That would be
51%.
They will say it's a lot more than that. All right. And then last part of this is for soldiers who may need temporary or long-term medical assistance for mental health disorders, the Army and the VA are prepared to provide them the best health care possible during this time. So in that 2006 public affairs guidance, they had key talking points. And I'll just give you a couple. I'm not going to go through the whole thing. And these key talking points are, quote, unique to this war is that military leadership is taking a proactive approach. The military is doing a number of things to reduce stigma and improve access to care. There are numerous opportunities for Reserve and National Guard to receive immediate mental health attention. And they, the Army leaders, are proactively addressing mental health needs of soldiers with early intervention and working to build resilience. Okay? So that's in May of 2006. In 2005, I got fed up with all the rosy reports that were being delivered by military leaders and civilian leaders in the military to Congress and to the media that everything was according to that peg I had just read. And I filed a DOD IG complaint against the head of military medicine for negligence and perpetrating a mental health crisis. And this is after years of me forwarding information up the chain of command. And so I became that whistleblower, right? That we'll get to in a second. My IG complaint, I sent to all the Surgeon Generals. I sent it to all the heads of military medicine in the Pentagon and to congressional members. A DOD IG complaint, typically you're protected as the writer of that from disclosures. So I did the opposite. I fully disclosed it. I didn't, conceal it or try to hide behind it. I sent it to everybody. This led to the DOD Task Force on Mental Health to be congressionally mandated by Barbara Boxer and Joseph Lieberman in Congress. And in 2007, the DOD Task Force on Mental Health, after over a year of its study, which it could have done in 1 month because they had all the information already, published its findings. Again, you have the 2006 Public Affairs Guidance that the military leaders are proactively addressing stigma and the best mental health care is available to all service members. And then that's 2006. Here's it is in June 2007. This is what the Surgeon Generals are now saying. The time for action is now. The human and financial costs of unaddressed problems will rise dramatically over the time. Our nation learned this lesson at a tragic cost in the years following the Vietnam War. Fully investing in prevention, early intervention, and effective treatment are responsibilities incumbent upon us as we endeavor to fulfill our obligation to our military service members. In that DOD task force report, there were 99 recommendations, all of which showed that there was critical shortages of staffing. Nobody was getting treatment. There was no monitoring and treatment. There was very little transition services for reintegrating. There was very little support for family members. Every aspect of mental health was a failure. Everything was directly opposite of what the military was saying from 2003 up until 2007. Everything was great, right? So that gives you a little backdrop. And I just wanted to kind of touch base before we lose track of time, is that I mentioned I filed that IG complaint in 2005, and then I followed it up again in 2006. And what was it, 2000, and I apologize about these dates, I'm trying to get it straight. In September of 2006, which is before that DOD task force released its findings, it was why they're still investigating, there was a U.S. Navy public affairs guidance published. And this one had my name on it, literally. It said on September 22, 2006, I'm sorry. This was in 2007, this Navy PEG. This is after the DOD task force report. Okay. And according to the U.S. Navy's Public Affairs Guidance, on September 22nd, 2006, Stars and Stripes Pacific Edition published an article entitled Officers Sees Perfect Storm Brewing in Military's Mental Health Care System. The article quoted Commander Mark Russell, a Navy psychologist stationed at U.S. Naval Hospital Yokosuka. The U.S. Today article reiterates Commander Russell's position that the military does not have enough mental health providers. That was among much other things, but that was accurate. So the Navy's public affairs guidance, with my name on it, had these key messages and talking points that was DoD policy on how to address what I was saying about the mental health crisis in the military. And this is, again, quoting from this public affairs guidance. Navy medicine's goal is to ensure that every returning sailor and Marine receives any necessary mental health care services as early as possible. Providing prevention and treatment services as early as possible is the best way to prevent the long-term effects of war. Navy and Marine Corps leadership are committed at every level to the issue of mental health. They are proactively addressing mental health needs with early intervention and working to build resilience prior to combat deployments. Navy medicine has more mental health resources available at home and in theater than ever before in an attempt to provide sailors and Marines with information about combat stress and its impact on mental and behavioral health. Navy medicine continuously monitors access and utilization of mental health assets and is working to increase the number of providers and portals of care where needed. Okay, so that was in 2007, and they're, again, basically trying to undermine my message that there's a mental health crisis, right?
Yes.
So remember now, in that guidance in 2007, it says they're working to increase the number of providers, right? Okay, well, on February 28th, 2007, which is about 1 month after that public affairs guidance was published by the Navy, I received a memo, as did everybody else in the Navy, that the U.S. Navy was going to eliminate all of its active duty social worker positions, eliminate it. And that Navy social workers were given a choice. They can either go green or go out, meaning they can join the Army or they can leave the service altogether. Right? That was published in February, and then they retracted it a couple months later because of the June 2007 task force report came out in June, and then they retracted that position. I guess we're not going to eliminate our military social workers. So that's that delay, the deception part, and the delay again is.
Well, it's also the potential for punishing.
Yeah.
Watch your tune, dude, because we're going to eliminate all of that. In effect, the front line of defense in terms of mental health, we're going to eliminate those social workers and get them out. Did people take that seriously then, given the fact that just months later they said, never mind? I mean,
I had friends of mine in the Navy, social workers, who went Army, and a couple who left the military because of that memorandum.
It was revoked, and
it was revoked months later. It came out in February, and people were given a tight timeline to make a decision because they wanted to eliminate it right away. A whole discipline of mental health providers in the middle of a crisis in 2007, suicide crisis, unmet mental health needs, all that stuff is going on. And we're going to eliminate an entire branch of mental health services. Active duty, we're going away for the Marines and the Navy.
And I assume who wrote that or who had authority. Did they change their mind later? Did they?
They did.
What the fuck was going on?
Well, yeah, when the June task force report came on and that memorandum was circulating still, they retracted it.
Oops.
Even after that time frame. But by that time, not only was the damage done because we were leaking mental health providers in the middle of a major mental health crisis to begin with.
Huge.
But it also just goes to the lack of coordination, the lack of sensitivity, a lack of awareness, the lack of caring about mental health, that you would even author that type of policy.
Yeah, that it's almost wasn't in your mind. You hadn't even been thinking about it. It wasn't really formulated. It's just,
Yeah.
let's try that.
Yeah. Well, here I am. I'm getting this memorandum of eliminating social workers. I'm sitting at a Marine Corps base, as we talked about in the first segment. I'm the only uniform mental health provider for 6,000 Marines, and I'm covering 2 other bases in Japan on watch 24/7 because of the critical shortages in mental health staff. And yet you get this memorandum that says, we're going to make it worse. We're
Yeah.
going to eliminate all the social workers. And see, how do you like that? You know, it's like,
Well,
how
so
mad is that?
what did you do when you got that?
Got pissed, screamed. I immediately contacted the leaders in the Pentagon that I had access to and said, this is the exact opposite that we ought to be doing. These are the same people I submitted my DODIG complaint to, and I had statistics to show we were not recruiting enough mental health providers in the military, Army, Navy, Air Force, to replace those who were leaving the military. And the military was still discharging military mental health providers because they didn't get promoted to the next rank. They were being discharged even though they wanted to stay in, because that was the policy. So we're bleeding mental health providers, and yet you got this crazy asinine top level mandate to eliminate more mental health providers. And we got a suicide crisis. We got all these people crying for help, and we can't meet their needs. And what the hell are we doing? So words to that effect. Basically, I was told to stay in my lane. And, these are higher level decisions that a commander doesn't need to be questioned.
Is this what set you off that
Amongst other things. Yeah, that's
among other things?
Yeah.
Can you share those other things, or it's not quite relevant to what we're talking about?
We'll come up in other episodes. I'll
Okay.
share some more inside stories of that. But
Okay.
I just wanted to say that, so my being a whistleblower, I got reprised against. I was the top ranked commander in this command. I had been handpicked by an admiral to develop the Navy's PTSD treatment program. And I was stationed in a rural base in Japan to do that, et cetera, et cetera. And I got awarded for all these so-called groundbreaking efforts to provide training for EMDR and, for accessing evidence-based treatments for military members, et cetera. And I went from the top ranking commander to the lowest ranking commander, and I did not get promoted. And I did not expect anything different. But I wasn't the only one. So in 2012, the Army suspended several doctors at Joint Base Lewis and McChord who were found to have unethically changed deployment-related PTSD diagnosis of hundreds of Army soldiers to personality disorder so that they would not get pensions. Outrageous, right?
Outrageous.
Well,
Yeah.
The civilian doctor who was a whistleblower who informed the IG that this practice was going on at Joint Base Lewis and McChord was also suspended. So this issue about reprisal and whistleblower protection, that again, we'll have other opportunities to talk about it, but that's part of that deception and delay part of the military. Not only do you kill the message about the psychological realities of war, but you're going to kill the messengers too. You're going to discredit them. You're going to have publicity blackouts. I mean, I had a public affairs guidance with my name on it that was distributed throughout the Department of Defense. And what was my message? My message is we need more mental health providers.
Yeah.
Amongst other things, right? So go figure. That's the depth and the extent that the military uses this strategy to avoid, again, learning its lessons.
And it works.
And it works. It works.
Ah.
So
Yeah,
I
never.
yeah,
I
by
never
the way,
really.
I just want to say that I'd follow up. I did file a reprisal complaint with the DOD IG because the promotion thing that happened. And my IG complaint came back to me saying that there was no finding that, and it was signed off by the head of military medicine, who was the person I accused of being grossly negligent in handling mental health services. So basically, the subject of the investigation that I filed, the complaint, was the person who made the final determination that there's no merit to my complaint. And so there it goes.
Ah,
So it's a closed loop system
yeah.
that there's no accountability. Nobody got in trouble for anything. In June 2007, when the DoD task force released its report, that all those military leaders were lying to Congress in the media all those years about there wasn't a mental health crisis. And now in June 2007, suddenly we have an urgent crisis, and the time is now to act. Nobody got fired. In fact, people got promoted and got awards for this great task force report that took over a year to release its findings that everyone on the ground already knew. We didn't have enough providers. We weren't providing treatment. There's no reintegration plan. There's nothing about stigma. It's being used as a weapon, and family members were not being supported, et cetera, the whole gamut. So delay, deceive, and delay again.
Yes. But you're right. I mean, that is the perfect example of what we're talking about.
Yeah.
And the consequences. I mean, it's a terrible, I don't even know how to describe it accurately or adequately, but it's like if the entire Navy was against you, despite all of the people that worked within the Navy understood and had experienced a lot of the things you were talking about. So the generals, the admirals are the ones in effect who pull strings, et cetera, but yet don't really deal with the heartaches of war. I mean, maybe at some time they did, but
they're looking at it from the perspective of my message. And again, I was handling everything within the military for several years after I got back from my deployment in 2003. I sent dozens and dozens of memorandums up the chain of command that were data driven, that demonstrate all these issues that we talked about: shortage of staff, the lack of treatment, lack of inadequate training, et cetera, and not only complain about it, we gave concrete solutions. This is what we can do to fix it. Some of which was cost very little. It's just a matter of policy. But those same military leaders viewed that message, that transparency of mental health, as a threat to their ability to prosecute the war. And it was undermining the military. So I got an email back with the subject header in capital, Benedict Arnold, as and got so many of those types of emails or phone calls from people that were
that
irate.
motherfucker's the Benedict Arnold. It's not you.
No, I was.
That's the guy that has caused deaths, not you.
Well, that's certainly my perspective too, that those people who knew who had the power and authority to do something about it chose not to. In fact, they chose to not only say the emperor has clothes, but to tell the messenger the emperor didn't have clothes, to shut that person down and to get him out of the service, which is unfortunate, but not unexpected. But again, that's the extent that the military views mental health as a threat to its ability to fulfill its first mission, to fight and win wars.
But yet, the second mission, as you pointed out every time we talk about this,
Right.
is to take care of all of us.
First health protection. Yeah. It's okay if it's bullets and it's shrapnel wounds and it's, dental issues or, immunizations. That part the military does an amazing job at meeting the medical needs of its service members. But when it comes to mental health is uniquely seen as a threat, and it has been such since the First World War. And mental health providers are viewed as a great deal of animosity, distrust, mixed blessing. They need us if there's a suicidal Marine or a suicidal art soldier, how to get rid of and expedite administrative separation of people the military does not want in its ranks. So we're valuable in that end of it, but that's the rest of it they could do without us. And I'm still optimistic besides that. Yeah.
Yeah, I need to sleep. I'm not optimistic yet. I need to clear my mind.
Yeah.
The hope really are the people that are listening to this, that are watching this, that have read our book, that have this affinity and love and caring about this 1%. I mean,
yeah,
they're the ones that we hopefully will be pulling into our audience as soon as possible.
Well, we sure hope so. And for those who aren't affiliated with the military, and have not served and don't have family members that have served, I think the other part we want to address is that this issue is not unique to the military. In fact, mental health stigma exists as it does outside the military, and the lack of treatment resources, the shortage of mental health providers throughout this nation. There's a direct reflection of what's going on in the military. If the military became a true leader in mental health, and as far as removing the disparity between mental and physical health and elevating mental health as a priority as it should, along with physical health, that would be the model, the working model for the civilian, the private sector.
Yeah, I'm sure you're right, because
yeah,
I'm right.
Pretty confident about that.
Yes,
so it affects us all, and if those who are not affiliated with the military want to look at just from the standpoint of mental health in general in the private sector for themselves, for their children, for their loved ones, then these issues absolutely matter. And I hope that can be served maybe as a motivation for some people who get involved and advocate for change who have nothing to do with the military, but have the desire to improve the status of mental health care in general.
I think I'm seeing that at Tulane, not all that much different than other universities. There are young folks who are concerned about their own mental health and have experienced bad things, and they talk about it in class. And I teach courses related to trauma, so you wouldn't take the class otherwise. But I can see significant changes, at least among the college students. Maybe beyond that, that's not much hope, but yeah, for them, they're rather sophisticated. I mean, the whole area I've gotten 38,000 citations because of the interest that the general public has about compassion fatigue, among other things, secondary trauma, et cetera. And I think it's not because of me or my writing or whatever. It's just that's in the vogue. That's acceptable. That is something to care about as young people. So I guess I am optimistic on the one hand when I look into their eyes and hear how they talk about this phenomenon. And also just the shock of people in the military who had no idea of what was happening that you're familiar with. They, as you say, they would be, "Ooh, this is news to me," kind of thing. And
absolutely.
But I guess what I'm thinking of is that that we're on the right track, that I completely agree with you. The military is an excellent context, because early on, when people were not that sophisticated about things, saying, yeah, someone has this syndrome like they were in the military, right? And the PTSD. And when I started suggesting it's not just the military,
right?
And now we have citations from every aspect, anywhere there is human services, nurses, for example, that's critically important. Anyone who works with the general public, that's important. Have a bad day.
Yeah, it's a broad reach. And so, again, that's why it's worth mentioning that while we're focusing on military mental health care, by no means are these lessons unique to the military or solely owned by the military.
First responders, they're getting compensation.
You betcha. But as the military goes, as we say, as the military
Okay.
goes, so goes society. So I think the
Yes.
military can be a leader, as they did with racial integration, right? After the Second World War, as it did with integrating gender
Yes.
during the Vietnam era, and then recently with sexual orientation being integrated. Now, are there problems with military sexual trauma? Is there racial problems? Are there sexual
Oh,
discrimination? Sure.
absolutely.
But the military is at least, making a concerted effort and implementing these policies of zero tolerance of that type of discrimination, and has mechanisms for holding perpetrators accountable in the military. Not perfect, but at least that is the intent, that is the policies, and in many cases the practices. So if the military were to dedicate a zero tolerance for mental health stigma and elevated mental health on par with physical health, then I think that would certainly go a ways to addressing the mental health needs of the 99% who don't join the military as well.
That's
So
a good way to end our fabulous
okay.
podcast.
Yeah. All right, good. So let's end it here, and we'll pick it up. I think we're going to talk about faulty diagnosis and backdoor discharges. We have a special guest joining us.
Yeah, right. Yes. Should we say his name? Jeff Yarbus. Yeah.
All right.
Very good guy. Just he left the military as a full colonel, Army, as a social worker not too long ago, maybe 3 years ago at most. So really very informed. We co-edited a book together on combat social work. So very informed, good guy.
Yeah, I look forward to talking with him, and I'm be real curious what his response was to our discussion about the Navy's decision to eliminate all of its social workers. And
I'll bet he doesn't know about it. I'll bet you.
Probably, yeah. Let's check that out. But until then, stay safe. All right.
Thank you.
Yeah.
You too.
All right. See ya. Sayonara.
Sayonara.